Some corporations are ahead of governments in working towards goals such as net zero carbon in their business. Well, how did that happen? It doesn't stop some of the campaigners saying that they are the problem and they should be brought down. Are they right? Some on the other side say they're being infected by ideological wokeness and businesses need to stick to what they do best. Well, are they right? I spent 20 years working with companies on their corporate social responsibility, and it's time I talked about what's happening and why. It's an important story of how your world is changing in ways that you've probably not even noticed. So let's have a look. The superpower of the human race that pulled us from subsistence living to relative prosperity was trade. The ability to specialise and then to exchange goods. The classic Adam Smith vision, summarised by this quote: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." A multitude of traders operating in their self-interest, leading to a beneficial outcome for broader society. Well, that simple description doesn't cover it anymore. The Industrial Revolution used inputs of concentrated forms of energy to make massive increases in the scale of production. The new world that it created particularly rewarded innovation, the engine of creative destruction that made most of our progress possible. It led to the rise of the corporatized economy, with massive global companies, the like of which Adam Smith could hardly have ever imagined. The basic beneficial consequences of trade remain exactly as he described them, but now you had entities that, left to their own initiatives, would tend towards becoming monopolies. Governments realised that however hands-off they wanted to be, they certainly had to prevent that from happening, because a monopoly would force prices up, it would have reduced incentive for innovation, and progress would stall. But then also, there are unintended consequences of scale. Huge corporations make a bigger impact on the world, negative as well as positive. And there's nothing in the capitalist system that incentivises companies to take ownership of those unintended consequences. Quite the reverse. If you can dump the cost of your pollution, for instance, onto the rest of society, then you've externalised those costs to your own benefit. Government will regulate some of those unintended consequences, but others can be novel, they can be hard to identify or quantify. So the question rises whether companies should be choosing to be better corporate citizens, to make their money, of course, to fuel the engine of progress, but also to clean up their mess and do the right thing. Well, that sounds lovely and obvious, but the devil's always in the detail. Socially responsible business isn't a new phenomenon. Look back to the heyday of the Industrial Revolution. The factories were growing, employing thousands of people, many of whom had been impoverished in the countryside as agriculture needed fewer and fewer workers to work the land. These were people who had come into the city in desperation. The jobs they found in industry could be pretty grim, certainly by today's standards, but the conditions and the income were still a lot better than the alternative. The factories were the first part of the process of starting the upward development spiral, starting from what had been an extremely low base. Remember, the reality for the vast majority of the population of every country in the world up until the 19th century was abject poverty. Many of those people suffered, but they'd always suffered. They found their new conditions in the cities and the other places where the factories were to be better than what they had had before. Because remember, there was no health service, there was no social security, nothing. There were charities for the poor. Not every business owner thought that was enough. Even though society had never seen anything different, some thought it was both possible and desirable to imagine better, which is a form of innovation in itself. Take, for instance, George Cadbury. The Cadbury family was making chocolate, doing very well from it. Cadbury decided that he would build a town alongside his factory, which became Bourneville. Here he would house his workers in a decent, well-managed environment. He felt that if he had a healthy, culturally stimulated and thriving workforce, then it would all be to the benefit of his business. And in any case, he was a Quaker, and it seemed to him, based on his moral values, to be the right thing to do. We now know very well that giving good conditions for your employees and demonstrating that you actually care about them is very good business practice. It rewards you with employee motivation and loyalty. Those are real business benefits. Nobody assumed that to be the case in Cadbury's time. The majority of factories maximised profit by keeping employment costs low because there were plenty of desperate people who needed the work and not worrying too much about safety and the like. Cadbury's businesses did better than many of his contemporaries because it turned out that giving a damn about your own people was smart business. It wasn't the only reason. The time was right for that sort of business, for sure. As a Quaker, it also helped that he believed in living simply and didn't extract vast amounts of money to fund a lavish lifestyle, but he invested it instead back into the business, unlike some of his contemporaries. Throughout the history of business, you'll find characters like that. People with a strong sense of personal values who decided to rebel against standard practice where it seems to them to be not moral or responsible. It's a tiny minority for sure. So while they could be remarkable and inspiring, you can't rely on them alone to solve the big problems if an industry is creating them. Which is why eventually regulation emerges. Over time, the human race solves problems. As the Industrial Revolution created more wealth, it gradually raised standards of living, and then at some point people wanted to fill in those gaps. They wanted to create better sanitation and basic living conditions. Cities invested in infrastructure like sewers and roads. And while all of that was going on, all the businesses had to do was focus on doing business, making money, pursuing their own self-interest. In the early part of the 20th century, the economy was becoming more and more global, more and more interconnected, and it was thriving as never before as a result. Then came the First World War, and everything changed. The impact of the war, the punitive terms placed on the losers of the war, combined to create recession. Countries responded to recession with policies to look within, to introduce protectionism, to encourage self-sufficiency or autarky, and those policies fed the Great Depression, creating the circumstances that led to the Second World War. The Allied countries were keen, coming out of the Second War, to avoid the same mistakes. They got together at Bretton Woods and agreed to create what became known as the Bretton Woods institutions. The World Bank and the IMF were the first. The World Trade Organization, that didn't turn into reality until much later. The aim was to create a post-war economic order that would provide a consensual framework for trade, that would balance economic interests with social ones, particularly so poorer countries could also progress on the developmental curve, and to avoid the isolationism of the recent past. And it worked, largely. Throughout all of that, the role of business was business. In the 1970s, the concept of corporate social responsibility first started to be talked about. That prompted the influential economist Milton Friedman to famously attack the idea. He said this: "There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud." In other words, governments set the rules. Within those rules, company bosses only had responsibilities to the profits of the corporation. But that was never going to hold as a position, because the world was changing. And it started with these two, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They launched a deregulation push in the 1980s, removing capital controls, creating a truly globalized economy. Soon, you could notice that 51 of the largest economies in the world were actually corporations and not countries. The rise of the truly global corporation that could decide to headquarter itself wherever it liked, along with all the financial muscle that they had, changed the dynamics of world politics forever, because suddenly you had truly unaccountable power. Look at it this way. In the slightly older world, global power and diplomacy was exercised exclusively between nation states. I mean, more or less. There were some companies that acted on behalf of states, such as the East India Company. I'm not talking about those. Companies were subject to the laws of the country where they were based and wholly constrained by them. They needed to get permission of the state to trade, implicitly or explicitly, depending on the country. That permission could be withdrawn if they behaved in ways that the state held to be intolerable in some way. But with the rise of the truly global megacorporations, that all changed. Suddenly you had businesses with the power to create huge numbers of jobs, highly desirable from the point of view of the state. The corporations could choose to locate themselves wherever they liked. And then suddenly those states have an incentive to attract those businesses to base themselves there, because it will create investment and jobs. They began to compete to offer the lowest regulatory barriers, the lowest tax burden, the most favourable trading conditions. It's not that the power balance had been wholly reversed, but it had been significantly reversed. And also now you have states talking to states globally, but also states carrying out international diplomacy with corporations, and indeed corporations with other global corporations. A massive shift in power. The question then is always this: how is power held to account? Because the world won't tolerate for too long the exercise of unaccountable power. And that made the rise of corporate social responsibility inevitable. When I was working in it, some predicted it would be a fad that would soon pass, but it didn't, and it couldn't, because it was seeking an answer to a real question that won't go away. There's also the point that as the world gets more crowded, there are a number of major challenges we face as a society. Some of the very features that make corporations good at innovating and making money are also extremely useful in helping to solve those problems. So this is the dynamic. Large corporations, they create an impact on society. A lot of that is massively positive, something the campaigners rarely notice or acknowledge. They create wealth. Governments don't. Governments only run because they can tax the people that do create wealth. The corporations create things that people want and need. They create jobs, which is a vehicle for people to support themselves and their families and to develop their skills and their marketability. But then there are also the negatives. They create emissions and often pollution through their operations. Their supply chains may feed undesirable social phenomena such as child labour or forced labour or just poor supplier working conditions. There are various other things people fairly and often unfairly put at their door as well. But then they also have the capacity to help solve problems. The things they bring to the table include innovation, financial power, obviously, logistical skills, efficient management. And we've seen this in action. One of the only organisations, remember, that emerged with credit from Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was the retail giant Walmart. It was a company that even then the campaigners loved to hate. But while the federal government was slow and inadequate in meeting the scale of the disaster that unfolded, Walmart, with its massive business, which is built effectively on the efficiency of its logistics. That's how it gets products at the lowest possible prices. It mobilised a huge operation to get provisions in and help people get out of the affected areas. And even in this pandemic, if you're looking to unpick why the UK vaccines operation was strong and the EU operation was weak, one of the influences was the UK set up a task force that had business experience represented on it, and they actively created partnership deals with the pharmaceutical companies to support them in the processes of innovation and then pushing to scale. The EU took a more traditional adversarial negotiating stance, pushing down prices, demanding delivery, and so on. And it reflects a major difference in a perspective that informs the debate around corporate social responsibility. Do you see businesses as potential allies, albeit ones that have to work within a framework of rules? Or do you see them as mad dogs that must be controlled? There was a film a couple of decades ago called The Corporation, the thesis for which was that corporations fitted the psychological profile of the psychopath. Why, it asked, have we enabled it and given it so much power? There was nothing in their description, though, that didn't equally apply to the nation state. Organised groupings of people at scale follow incentives, broadly their own self-interest. The question for businesses, therefore, becomes how do you create incentives that care about anything other than just the bottom line, not instead of a bottom line? You need the Adam Smith element of self-interest to make it work. Recently, people have been talking about the version that first arose decades ago, but is now championed by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, that of the stakeholder corporation. That's where companies are given a legal responsibility to be accountable to a wide range of the people and groups that depend on it or are in a substantial way affected by it. Stakeholders. I've never been attracted to that because it's applying constraints to the business process based on groups whose knowledge of and support for the business may be extremely low. You have to have a system that works with people the way they are, not just the way you'd like them to be. The corporate social responsibility movements, at least in the UK, picked up speed over recent decades for two reasons. One was the leadership of individual senior figures, leadership in areas of enlightened self-interest. The other was the natural reaction of businesses to the consequences and the backlash created by globalization. Businesses came together originally in the UK because government wanted them to invest in the inner cities that were hit by riots in the 1980s. The organisation Business in the Community became a focal point for this, with some of the top chief executives of business becoming engaged on a range of issues, going from how businesses could invest in education, in health, in other social issues, through to environmental management and their responsibilities in the marketplace. David Seif, one of the founding family of the retailer Marks & Spencer, put the philosophy like this: healthy high streets need healthy back streets. In other words, businesses prosper when society prospers. So you have an enlightened self-interest in making that happen. People who say that rich people get rich by keeping other people poor, they've forgotten the lesson of Henry Ford, who knew that if he didn't pay his workers enough, they would never be able to afford his cars. And the economics of capitalism comes from achieving scale. It doesn't happen against a background of deprivation. And some of the business champions who have driven these sorts of agendas have been inspiring people. I've interviewed several of them for the first version of my podcast, such as Paul Polman, the former chief executive of Unilever, Richard Walker, the managing director of Iceland Foods, smart business savvy leaders who also know that if businesses aren't sustainable in the long term, then by definition they will fail. But businesses have also been pushed to respond because we now live in the social media age, and so what happens in your supply chain can end up all over the Facebook feed of your customers in a flash. Whether it's child labour, whether it's environmental impacts, whether it's treating employees badly, whether it's egregiously avoiding taxes, there's now a bunch of expectations from society on business, and that simply wasn't the case back in the 1970s when Milton Friedman wrote his essay. Now we're seeing two phenomena. One I see as remarkably positive, and one I see as being negative and potentially able to destroy the balance of where we've gotten to so far. The positive is that businesses are pragmatic, problem-solving entities. And so while political systems have been slow to get into gear on responding to global problems, such as overfishing, such as plastic pollution, and of course climate change, businesses have made some real progress in those areas. For example, governments find it practically impossible to negotiate fishing rights because they always protect their own industry, even though the fish couldn't care less about national boundaries. But corporations who sell seafood-based products have an interest in creating supply systems that are sustainable. Because, no fish fingers. So they can be, in some ways, better placed to take action on transnational issues because they have an interest and they act through the marketplace in a global fashion. On climate change, there are now a significant number of major corporations who have committed their businesses to becoming net zero by 2050, if not sooner, in line with the Paris Agreement, even though they personally are not signatories directly to that agreement. Because the challenge is this: can we move to a non-carbon based energy and still become more prosperous as a society while we do so? Increasing numbers of businesses believe we can, and they're committing all that energy and innovation and capital investment to that cause. Meanwhile, Campaigners glue themselves to buildings because they think the corporations are the problem. And somehow, if we shut them all down, that would somehow make things better. Well, the 1930s really tell us that that's not the case. So that's the positive. The trick is getting the balance right, and this is where the threat currently lies. Throughout my time on corporate social responsibility, we focused on enlightened self-interest and the business case for action. Businesses are pragmatic, non-ideological actors. They're used to managing change, which human organisations generally hate and resist. They look at data and trends, and they can make decisions based on likely future conditions, which human organisations generally fail abysmally at. But all of that depends on pragmatism. A pragmatism that's historically been developed because the marketplace doesn't suffer fools gladly. If you try to impose an ideology, or more often just an oversized corporate ego, on the market, it will laugh in your face and it will spit you out to the benefit of your competitors. The big question is this: is woke ideology now starting to take over in a number of companies through the open door afforded by corporate responsibility? Woke ideology is not the same thing as corporate social responsibility. One is an ideology. It will filter facts that don't fit its approved story. The other is pragmatic, informed by data, driven by results. People who are not knowledgeable about the history of all this, commentators like Ben Shapiro, for instance, who I respect enormously, they will see it's the same thing. Ben is still with Friedman. The business of business is business, and any interest in climate change or anything like that must be a sign of wokery. And I get that coming from commentators in the US. It's reflective of how the issues are being defined there. But it's simply not true. But it's becoming more true. And it could destroy the golden goose altogether. If businesses start to behave ideologically, either those individual businesses will go out of business to the benefit of their competitors, which is, maybe the least worst outcome. But the other would be that we enter a new period where the nature of business changes and becomes less pragmatic. It operates according to the values of society, and those values begin to militate against the benefits of free trade as we've seen them. And then that becomes a gamble, because maybe it'll work, maybe there's a trade-off to be had, maybe slightly lower rates of wealth creation tempered by greater investments in the infrastructure that makes business possible, which includes the global environment. Maybe that would lead to the best outcomes. But the market system works because the system has a powerful logic of its own. All it asks people to do is to follow the obvious incentives. In this case, you're asking human beings to create a system that will deliver rewards that are not inherent to a natural dynamic of the system. The human race has a pretty poor, and I mean millions dying in famines level of poor, track record of successfully doing that. It's why I always believe that pragmatic businesses with some sense of values and citizenship was the best answer. And there's some research evidence to support that. The well-known business book Built to Last by Jim Collins and Jerry Porras showed that one of the distinctive features of the businesses that had been enduringly successful for 100 years or more, extraordinarily consistent businesses, was a purpose beyond profit. You don't inspire people to work together in the best possible way purely in the cause of increasing returns to shareholders. I know, weird but true. Woke businesses, I fear, are taking that principle and missing the most important details. It's not about abandoning pragmatism and becoming ideological. And in effect, that's where they're headed. Woke influences on tech companies are seeing them censoring not just demonstrably damaging content, but opinion that doesn't match a relatively recently arrived orthodoxy. I mean, seriously, people have been thrown off Twitter for saying that a woman is defined as a human female, which is something we all knew to be true until yesterday, which is why it's still in the dictionaries. Whatever's happening there, pragmatism it isn't. And companies are going to feel this first in their HR departments. When I was active on these issues, we were focused on promoting equal opportunities. There are all sorts of great reasons why businesses should care about genuine diversity. Making it work isn't a trivial matter. The businesses that do it best, they create a set of their own corporate values, purpose beyond profit, and their own identity that becomes more important to their employees while at work than their various differences of outlook or background. It's hard to do well, but it can really pay off. But now the importation of woke identity politics has significantly started to change that dynamic. Suddenly, people are focusing on things like race to the exclusion of all else. And that is generating conflict and resentment, and it doesn't end well. And governments are conspiring to make it worse. For instance, publicising the gender pay gap as a name and shame figure. It creates a dynamic around a number that literally doesn't mean what people think that it means. Reducing your gender pay gap leads you to incentivise behaviours you don't want. Like not taking on graduate females, not letting them take flexible working, because those highly desirable things will increase your gender pay gap. It's not about equal pay for equal work. That's the kind of head-scratchingly dumb behaviour that happens when ideology influences how systems are designed. Systems create incentives. The studies confirm that people follow incentives, so don't incentivise dumb outcomes. Simple. And as of the heart for the challenge for corporate social responsibility, we have a system, capitalism, that works brilliantly to achieve the social outcomes of society. But while the social numbers have all been heading up, the environmental numbers have been heading down, and hidden in those social numbers are some short-term problems as well. Can you tweak the system so that it keeps delivering the goods while eliminating the bads? That's the nature of the innovation some companies are now looking for, and without it, you will not have a long-term sustainable society that people want to live in. Potential partners, mad dogs to be controlled, all depends on the sort of future we want.